Marcus Webb found the white horse chained to a dead tree in the desert, her body covered in blood and wounds, dying alone in the scorching heat. When their eyes met, the combat veteran made a decision that would either save them both or destroy what little he had left to lose. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of red rock and scorched earth that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. The sun hung mercilessly overhead, bleaching the landscape into shades of copper and gold, while the heat rose in shimmering waves from the cracked ground below. This was a place where life clung stubbornly to existence, where every creature knew the price of survival and paid it daily. In the distance, the jagged peaks of ancient rock formations stood like sentinels, their weathered faces telling stories of millennia past. The silence here was profound, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Marcus Webb had seen many deserts in his time: Iraq, Afghanistan, places where the sand got into everything and the heat could kill you as surely as any bullet. But he had never expected to find himself alone in the American Southwest, driving down a forgotten dirt road with nothing but his old pickup truck and the ghosts of his past for company. At 52 years old, Marcus carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had spent decades in uniform, though now his military bearing was softened by the weight of too many memories and too many sleepless nights. His beard, once neatly trimmed according to regulations, had grown longer since his retirement, showing more gray than the dark brown of his youth. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much, eyes that held a distant look even when he smiled, which was rare these days. The truck rattled over another pothole, and Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles showing white against his sun-darkened skin. He had been driving for hours, following a road that barely deserved the name, searching for something he couldn't quite define. Peace, perhaps, or maybe just a place where the noise in his head would finally quiet down. The Veterans Hospital had suggested he try spending time in nature, said it might help with what they clinically called post-traumatic stress disorder, but what Marcus simply thought of as the inability to forget. So he had packed his truck with camping supplies and pointed it toward the desert, toward emptiness and solitude, toward anything that might offer respite from the crowded chaos of his thoughts. The road curved around a massive outcropping of red sandstone, and Marcus slowed the truck, squinting against the glare. Something had caught his eye, a flash of white against the rust-colored landscape that didn't belong. At first he thought it might be a piece of trash, some discarded plastic sheeting caught on the rocks, but as he drew closer, his heart began to pound with a recognition he didn't yet understand. He pulled the truck to a stop, the engine ticking in the sudden silence, and stepped out into the crushing heat. The door slammed behind him with a hollow metal sound that echoed across the empty land. What Marcus saw made him freeze in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. There, chained to the gnarled trunk of a long dead tree, was a horse. But not just any horse. This animal was pure white, or had been once, its coat now streaked with dirt and dried blood from dozens of wounds and scratches that crisscrossed its body like a map of suffering. The horse was down on its side, its ribcage heaving with labored breaths that Marcus could see even from a distance. Heavy chains wrapped around the animal's neck and legs, attached to the tree with a brutality that spoke of deliberate cruelty. The tree itself was a twisted skeleton, its bark long since stripped away by wind and time, standing alone in a small clearing surrounded by jagged rocks and thorn bushes. Marcus moved forward slowly, his boots crunching on the loose gravel, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Old habits died hard. The horse's eye, visible now as he approached, rolled toward him with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked almost like resignation. The animal tried to lift its head but failed, the chains rattling with the effort, and Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, a feeling he had tried to keep buried for so long that experiencing it now was almost painful. It was compassion, raw and overwhelming, mixed with a rage so fierce it made his hands shake. Who would do this? The question hammered through his mind as he knelt beside the suffering animal, his practiced eyes taking in the extent of the damage. The horse was severely dehydrated, its skin stretched tight over prominent bones, tongue swollen and lips cracked from thirst. The scratches and cuts suggested the animal had struggled violently against its restraints, possibly for days, tearing its own flesh in a desperate attempt to break free. Some of the wounds were deep, and flies had already begun to gather, their buzzing an obscene soundtrack to this scene of abandonment. The chains themselves were industrial weight, the kind used for towing vehicles, wrapped multiple times around the horse's neck in a way that would have made breathing difficult, even without the added stress of dehydration and exhaustion. Marcus reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched the horse's neck, feeling the rapid flutter of its pulse beneath his fingertips. The animal's skin was hot to the touch, burning with fever, and when the horse's eye met his again, Marcus saw in that dark depths a plea that transcended species. This creature wanted to live. Despite everything, despite the pain and the abandonment and the certainty of death that must have seemed inevitable, this horse still held on to life with a tenacity that Marcus recognized in himself. Easy now, big fella. Easy. Marcus's voice was hoarse, roughened by emotion and the dry air. His hand moved instinctively to comfort the animal, stroking the dirty white coat with a gentleness that surprised him. He hadn't touched another living being with such tenderness in years, had forgotten that his hands were capable of anything other than destruction. The horse made a sound, a weak whinny that was more breath than voice, and something inside Marcus shifted irrevocably. He was looking at himself, he realized. This chained creature fighting for survival in an unforgiving landscape, abandoned and wounded but still refusing to surrender. This was his reflection. His truth made flesh and bone. The veteran stood up, his mind already racing through possibilities. The nearest town was at least 40 miles back the way he had come, and his cell phone had no signal out here in this godforsaken emptiness. He had water in the truck, but not enough for a horse this size, and certainly not enough to make a real difference in its condition. The chains would need to be cut, which meant he needed tools he didn't have, medical supplies, a vet, transportation for an animal that probably couldn't stand, let alone walk. The logical part of his brain, the part trained by years of military service to assess situations objectively, told him that this horse was beyond saving, that the kindest thing would be to end its suffering as quickly and humanely as possible. But another part of him, a part he had thought was dead and buried under layers of trauma and numbness, refused to accept that conclusion. Marcus returned to his truck and grabbed his water supply, 3-gallon jugs that had been meant to last him several days. He didn't hesitate. Back at the horse's side, he poured water into his cupped palm and held it near the animal's mouth. The horse's tongue moved weakly, lapping at the precious liquid with a desperation that broke Marcus's heart. He poured more, slowly, carefully, knowing that too much too fast could be dangerous, but unable to deny the creature this basic mercy. The horse drank and drank, and Marcus kept pouring until the first jug was empty, then started on the second. While the animal drank, Marcus examined the chains more closely. They were secured with heavy padlocks, the kind that would require bolt cutters or an angle grinder to remove. The tree trunk was too thick to cut through easily, and besides, he had nothing but a pocket knife. His mind worked through the problem with the same methodical approach he had once used to navigate minefields and clear hostile buildings. There had to be a way. There was always a way, if you were willing to think creatively and act decisively. That was what survival came down to in the end. Not giving up, even when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. The sun continued its merciless descent toward the western horizon, and Marcus knew that nightfall in the desert brought its own dangers. Temperature drops, predators, the disorientation of darkness in an unfamiliar place. He had maybe 3 hours of good daylight left, 3 hours to figure out how to save a dying horse in the middle of nowhere with insufficient supplies and no backup. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was just like combat, really. Impossible odds, limited resources, and a mission that mattered more than logic could explain. And just like in combat, failure was not an option he was willing to accept. Marcus looked down at the white horse, at this magnificent creature that someone had left here to die alone and in agony, and made his decision. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would save this animal or die trying. It wasn't about the horse anymore, if it ever had been. It was about proving to himself that redemption was possible, that something good could still come from hands that had dealt so much death, that the man he used to be before the wars might still exist somewhere beneath the scars. The white horse would live because Marcus Webb needed it to live. And that need, that desperate requirement for meaning in a world that had seemed meaningless for so long, gave him the strength to begin. Marcus ran back to his truck with a speed that surprised him, his legs remembering how to move with purpose even after years of purposeless wandering. His hands moved through the bed of the pickup with practiced efficiency, pulling out everything he owned that might be useful. A tire iron, a jack, a toolbox filled with wrenches and screwdrivers, a hunting knife with a blade he kept sharp enough to shave with. None of it was adequate for cutting through industrial chains, but Marcus had learned long ago that adequate was often less important than creative. He grabbed an old blanket too, thinking about shock and how the horse would need warmth once the sun set and the desert cold descended. Back at the tree, Marcus knelt in the dirt and began examining the setup more carefully. The chains were wrapped around the trunk multiple times before securing to the horse, and the padlocks holding everything together were positioned just out of the animal's reach. A deliberate cruelty that spoke of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Whoever had left this horse here wanted it to suffer slowly, wanted it to die knowing freedom was just inches away. The thought made Marcus's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. He had seen evil in his time overseas, had witnessed the worst that human beings were capable of inflicting on each other, but somehow this felt different. This was pure malice, without even the excuse of war or ideology or survival. The horse watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes as he worked, its breathing still labored, but perhaps slightly easier now that it had water in its system. Marcus talked to the animal as he examined the chains, his voice low and steady, the same tone he had once used to calm terrified soldiers pinned down under fire. "I'm going to get you out of this," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to get you out. You just have to hold on a little longer. Can you do that for me?" The horse made no sound, but its ear twitched in his direction, and Marcus chose to believe that meant yes. The tree was dead but still remarkably solid, its wood hardened by decades of desert sun into something nearly as tough as stone. Marcus tried the tire iron first, attempting to pry the chains away from the trunk, but the metal groaned and bent before the wood gave even slightly. He tried digging around the base of the tree, thinking he might be able to topple it, but the roots went deep and the ground was packed hard as concrete. An hour passed, then another, and the sun continued its inevitable journey toward the horizon, while Marcus tried every option he could think of and found each one wanting. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking through his shirt. His hands were bleeding now from scrapes and cuts accumulated during his frantic efforts, but he barely noticed. The horse had closed its eyes, conserving what little energy it had left, and Marcus found himself checking every few minutes to make sure the animal was still breathing. Each time he saw the rise and fall of that white ribcage, he felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. This creature was fighting, still fighting, and Marcus would be damned if he would be the one to give up first. As the shadows lengthened and the light began to take on the golden quality that preceded sunset, Marcus sat back on his heels and forced himself to think clearly. He was approaching this wrong, letting emotion drive his actions instead of his training. In combat, when a direct assault failed, you adapted. You found the weak point, exploited it, used the enemy's own strength against them. So what was the weak point here? Not the chains themselves and not the tree. His eyes traveled along the length of chain from the tree to the horse's neck, and suddenly he saw it. The lock securing the chain around the horse's throat was old, its mechanism possibly corroded by exposure to the elements. It was still strong enough to hold, but maybe, just maybe, it was vulnerable in a way the newer locks weren't. Marcus retrieved his hunting knife and examined the lock closely. The keyhole was clogged with rust and dirt, which meant the internal mechanism was probably compromised too. He had no key, but he didn't need one. What he needed was patience and precision, two things the military had taught him in abundance. He worked the tip of his knife into the shackle of the lock where it connected to the body, looking for any give, any weakness. The metal was stubborn, but Marcus was more stubborn. He wedged the tire iron against the knife blade, using it as a lever to apply pressure to the lock's weakest point. His muscles strained, his injured hands screaming in protest, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the desert silence, the lock gave way. The shackle snapped, and suddenly the chain around the horse's neck went slack. Marcus felt a surge of triumph so intense it almost brought tears to his eyes. "One down," he whispered. His voice was shaking. "One down." The horse seemed to sense the change immediately. Its eyes opened, focusing on Marcus with an intensity that was almost human in its understanding. The animal tried once more to lift its head, and this time succeeded, the loose chain sliding away from its throat. Marcus saw the raw, bleeding skin underneath where the metal had rubbed away hide and flesh, and his rage returned fresh and hot, but he pushed it down, channeling it into determination. Anger could wait. Right now, this horse needed him calm and focused. The chains on the horse's legs were secured differently, wrapped and locked in a way that made them harder to access with his improvised tools. Marcus poured more water, the last of his supply, over the horse's mouth and then over its wounds, trying to clean away some of the dirt and dried blood. The animal shuddered at the touch but didn't try to pull away. There was trust there, Marcus realized with wonder. After everything this creature had been through, it still had the capacity to trust. That faith, that willingness to believe that help had finally arrived, made Marcus more certain than ever that he was doing the right thing. The sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Marcus knew he was running out of time. The temperature was already dropping, and soon it would be too dark to work safely. He attacked the leg restraints with renewed urgency, using the same technique that had worked on the neck chain. The first lock resisted stubbornly, then yielded with another sharp crack. The second took longer, and Marcus's hands were so slick with blood by the time it broke that he nearly dropped his knife. But it broke. With the chains finally removed, Marcus sat back and waited to see what the horse would do. For a long moment, the animal just lay there, as if it couldn't quite believe it was free. Then, with an effort that Marcus felt in his own bones, the horse began to move. It rolled onto its stomach first, legs folding beneath its body, gathering itself. The muscles in its shoulders bunched and trembled, and then, impossibly, the white horse began to stand. It was not graceful. The animal's legs shook violently, threatening to buckle with every second, and Marcus found himself on his feet, hands outstretched, ready to catch a 1,000-pound creature if it fell. But the horse didn't fall. It stood swaying but upright, its head held high despite everything. "Beautiful," Marcus breathed. "You beautiful, stubborn creature." The horse turned to look at him, and in that moment Marcus understood that he had saved more than an animal's life today. He had saved something in himself, some essential part of his humanity that he had thought was lost forever in the deserts of foreign wars. This white horse, scarred and wounded but still standing, was proof that survival was possible, that redemption was possible, that maybe, just maybe, Marcus Webb deserved to keep living too. The desert night closed in around them, and Marcus knew they couldn't stay here. The horse needed medical attention, food, a safe place to rest and heal. He needed to get them both back to civilization. But for now, in this moment, he simply stood beside the white horse in the gathering darkness and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt hope. The desert night descended with a suddenness that still surprised Marcus, even after his time in similar climates overseas. One moment the sky held the last traces of twilight, and the next, darkness wrapped around them like a heavy blanket studded with more stars than seemed possible. The temperature plummeted, and Marcus could see his breath misting in the air as he stood beside the trembling horse, both of them survivors of their own personal wars, both uncertain what came next. Marcus spread the blanket over the horse's back, tucking it carefully around the animal's shoulders and hindquarters. The horse accepted this ministration without protest, too exhausted to do anything but stand and breathe. Every few seconds, the animal would sway slightly, and Marcus's hand would shoot out to steady it, his palm pressing against that warm hide, feeling the life that pulsed beneath. They couldn't stay here. Marcus knew that with absolute certainty. Without water, without shelter, without medical supplies, both of them would be in serious trouble by morning. But moving a horse this weak, in the dark, across unfamiliar terrain, seemed like a recipe for disaster. He thought about his truck, sitting maybe 50 yards away, but separated from them by rocky ground and scattered thorn bushes that would be treacherous to navigate in darkness. Even if they made it to the vehicle, there was no way to get the horse into the truck bed, and he couldn't leave the animal here while he drove for help. Marcus had seen enough death to know that sometimes the universe gave you only one chance to save a life, and if you left, if you walked away for even the best of reasons, that life would be gone when you returned. The white horse had stood up against all odds, had chosen life over surrender, and Marcus would honor that choice by staying. So they would walk together. It was the only option that made sense, the only choice Marcus could live with. He retrieved a coil of rope from his truck along with a flashlight, some emergency rations, and a first aid kit that seemed pitifully inadequate for the task ahead. He fashioned a makeshift halter from the rope, working slowly and carefully, talking to the horse the entire time. His voice had become a constant presence in the silence, a tether connecting them both to hope. "I know you're tired," he said softly as he slipped the rope gently over the horse's head, avoiding the raw wounds on its neck. "I know every part of you hurts and you just want to lie down. But we need to move, not far, just to my truck, and then we'll figure out the rest." The horse's eye caught the beam of the flashlight, reflecting back at Marcus with an otherworldly glow. For a moment, he saw something in that gaze that stopped him cold. It was recognition, understanding, maybe even gratitude. This animal comprehended that Marcus was trying to help, that they were in this together now. The bond forming between them was unlike anything Marcus had experienced with another creature. It bypassed language and logic, operating on a level of pure instinct and need. They were two damaged souls who had found each other in the wasteland, and neither was willing to let the other fall. Marcus began to walk, keeping the rope loose in his hand, letting the horse set the pace. Each step the animal took was an act of tremendous courage. Its legs shook with the effort, muscles that had been compressed by chains for who knew how long, now struggling to remember their purpose. The horse's breathing came in harsh gasps that Marcus felt echo in his own chest, and more than once the animal stumbled, nearly going down. Each time Marcus was there, his body acting as a brace, his voice urging the horse onward. "Come on, friend. Just a little further. You can do this. I know you can." The 50 yards to the truck took nearly half an hour to cross. By the time they reached the vehicle, both man and horse were drenched in sweat despite the cold, trembling with exhaustion and strain. Marcus tied the rope to the truck's bumper with a knot that would release easily if the horse panicked and pulled, then opened the passenger door and retrieved a bottle of sports drink he'd been saving. He took a long swallow, feeling the sugar hit his bloodstream, then poured the rest into his cupped palm and offered it to the horse. The animal's tongue lapped weakly at the liquid, and Marcus made a mental note that they would need electrolytes, not just water, if this creature was going to survive. Now came the hard part. The road back to town was 40 miles of rough terrain, winding through canyons and across dry creek beds that would be difficult to navigate even in daylight. With a severely weakened horse in tow, the journey would take all night at minimum, possibly longer. Marcus couldn't tow the horse behind the truck at any real speed, which meant he would have to walk beside the animal the entire way, guiding it step by painful step back toward civilization. His body ached already from the effort of freeing the horse and getting it this far, and his bleeding hands throbbed with every heartbeat. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the white horse standing beside him, still on its feet against all probability, still fighting to survive. Marcus started the truck and put it in its lowest gear, barely above idle speed. The engine's rumble seemed obscenely loud in the desert quiet, and the horse startled, its eyes rolling white with fear. "Easy, easy," Marcus soothed, his hand on the horse's neck. "It's just noise. It won't hurt you. Nothing's gonna hurt you anymore." He began to walk, keeping pace with the crawling vehicle, and after a moment's hesitation, the horse followed. They moved at a pace that made glaciers look swift, the truck's headlights casting long shadows across the rutted road ahead, illuminating a path that seemed to stretch into infinity. The night deepened around them, and the cold intensified until Marcus's joints ached and his breath came in white clouds. The horse, despite the blanket, was shivering too, its body losing heat it couldn't afford to lose. Marcus knew that shock and hypothermia were real dangers now, as immediate as dehydration had been earlier. He stopped the truck periodically to check on the animal, to rub its legs and neck, trying to stimulate circulation and provide what little warmth his own body could offer. During these stops, he would lean against the horse, and the horse would lean back, both of them drawing strength from the contact. They passed the first mile marker around midnight, and Marcus allowed himself a small moment of hope. The horse was still moving, still putting one hoof in front of the other, even though every step must have been agony. He had seen this kind of determination before, in soldiers who refused to stop even when their bodies were destroyed, who kept going through sheer force of will because surrender was not in their nature. This white horse had the heart of a warrior, and Marcus found himself respecting the animal in a way he had respected few humans. Around 2 in the morning, they encountered their first real obstacle. A dry creek bed crossed the road, its banks steep and treacherous with loose rock. Marcus stopped the truck and walked the crossing with his flashlight, his heart sinking as he realized how difficult this would be for the horse. The descent was maybe 6 feet, followed by soft sand at the bottom, then an equally steep climb up the far side. A healthy horse could have managed it easily, but the white horse was far from healthy. For a moment, Marcus considered turning around, finding another route, but the map in his truck showed this as the only road back to town for miles in either direction. He led the horse to the edge of the creek bed and felt the animal balk, its body going rigid with fear or exhaustion or both. The flashlight beam showed the animal's legs trembling violently, and Marcus knew they were at a critical point. If the horse went down here, if it fell and injured itself further, that would be the end. But they couldn't stop, couldn't turn back. The only way out was through. Marcus positioned himself at the horse's shoulder, his hand firm on the rope, his voice steady despite his own fear. "Together," he said. "We go down together and we come up together. You trust me, and I'll trust you." The horse took a step forward, then another, its hooves sliding slightly on the loose stone. Marcus moved with it, his own footing precarious, ready to throw his weight against the animal if it started to fall. They descended slowly, painfully, each movement calculated and controlled. The horse's breathing was labored, its sides heaving, but it kept moving. When they reached the bottom, the soft sand tried to trap their feet, but Marcus urged the horse on before it could stop and lose momentum. The climb up the far side was worse, the horse's legs barely able to propel its weight upward, but somehow, impossibly, they made it. On solid ground again, the horse stood with its head hanging low, utterly spent, and Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You magnificent creature. You did it." They had crossed the creek bed, but Marcus knew they couldn't go much further tonight. The horse had reached its limit, and pushing beyond it would kill the animal as surely as leaving it chained to that tree. He drove the truck a little further, until he found a relatively flat area with some shelter from the wind provided by a rock formation. Here, he decided, they would rest until dawn. Marcus killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. The dashboard clock read 3:17 in the morning, and he had been awake for over 20 hours, most of them spent in physical labor that would have challenged him even in his younger years. But he couldn't rest yet. The horse needed care, needed attention, that couldn't wait until dawn. Marcus forced himself out of the truck, his joints protesting every movement, and walked back to where the white horse stood in the cone of the taillights. The animal looked worse under the harsh red glow of the brake lights. Its head drooped nearly to the ground, and its legs were locked in a stance that Marcus recognized as the body's last defense against total collapse. The horse's eyes were half closed, and its breathing had taken on a rattling quality that filled Marcus with dread. He had heard that sound before in field hospitals and burning vehicles, and it never meant anything good. The wounds on the horse's body had stopped bleeding but were caked with dirt and probably infected. Without antibiotics, without proper medical care, this creature might not survive the night despite everything they had been through together. Marcus retrieved every blanket and piece of clothing he could find in the truck and wrapped them around the horse, creating a cocoon of fabric that might help retain body heat. He used the last of his emergency water supply to clean the worst of the wounds, working by flashlight, his hands as gentle as he could make them despite their shaking. The horse flinched at his touch but didn't pull away, a testament to either trust or the simple fact that it no longer had the energy to resist. Each time Marcus's fingers encountered torn flesh or exposed bone, he felt his heart constrict. This magnificent animal had suffered so much, and Marcus found himself making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You're going to make it," he whispered. "I'm not going to let you die out here. Not after all this." When he had done everything he could for the horse, Marcus allowed himself to sit down, his back against the truck's tire, his eyes on the white shape barely visible in the darkness. He should try to sleep, should conserve his own strength for the remainder of the journey ahead, but sleep felt impossible. His mind was too active, racing through everything that had happened since he found the horse, analyzing every decision, second-guessing every choice. What if he had done something differently? What if he was missing something critical that would mean the difference between life and death? The desert night pressed in around them, vast and indifferent. Above, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a river of light that Marcus barely noticed, too focused on keeping watch over his patient. The temperature continued to drop, and he could see frost forming on the truck's metal surfaces, glittering in the starlight like scattered diamonds. His own body was shutting down, demanding rest he couldn't afford to take. But every time his eyes started to close, he would jerk awake, checking to make sure the horse was still standing, still breathing. Around 4 in the morning, Marcus noticed a change in the horse. The animal's head lifted slightly, and its ears, which had been flat against its skull, pricked forward. For a heart-stopping moment, Marcus thought this might be the end, that final surge of energy that sometimes preceded death. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the protest of his stiff muscles, and moved to the horse's side. But when he got there, he realized the horse wasn't dying. It was listening. Something in the desert had caught its attention, some sound or scent that Marcus's duller human senses couldn't detect. Then he heard it too. A distant howling carried on the wind. Coyotes, maybe wolves, attracted by the scent of blood and weakness. Marcus felt ice water flood his veins. In their current condition, neither he nor the horse could defend against a pack of predators. He had his hunting knife, but that would be useless against multiple attackers. The truck offered no real protection, the cab too small for the horse and the bed too high for the animal to reach. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the predators were closing in. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He built a fire. There was enough dead brush scattered around their camp to create a decent blaze, and fire was the one thing that would keep most predators at bay. He worked frantically, gathering wood with his flashlight clenched between his teeth, arranging it in a circle around the horse and truck. His hands fumbled with matches from his emergency kit, the first 3 breaking before he got one lit. The kindling caught, then the larger pieces, and soon flames leaped up into the night, pushing back the darkness and hopefully the danger that lurked within it. The horse watched him work with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Marcus imagined he saw approval there, or maybe just relief. They stood together inside their ring of fire, Marcus with his knife drawn despite knowing how inadequate it would be, the horse with its head raised and ears forward, both of them waiting. The howling grew closer, and Marcus could see eyes reflecting the firelight from the darkness beyond, green and gold pinpoints that circled their camp like malevolent stars. He counted at least 6, maybe more, and his grip tightened on the knife handle until his knuckles went white. But the predators didn't attack. They prowled around the perimeter, drawn by the scent of easy prey but repelled by the flames and perhaps by something else, some quality in the way Marcus stood his ground that communicated he would not go down easily. Minutes stretched into an hour, and gradually the circling eyes withdrew. The howls faded into the distance, and Marcus finally allowed himself to breathe normally again. The fire had saved them, but it had also consumed most of the available fuel. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. As the sky began to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep blue to pale gray, Marcus assessed their situation with morning clarity. The horse had survived the night, which was a victory in itself, but the animal was in desperate need of veterinary care. They had maybe 15 miles left to reach town, 15 miles that would take most of the day to cover at their current pace. Marcus's own condition was deteriorating too. His hands were badly infected from the cuts and scrapes, swollen and hot to the touch. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache, and a headache throbbed behind his eyes from dehydration and exhaustion. But none of that mattered. They would keep moving forward because there was no other choice. When full daylight arrived, Marcus kicked dirt over the fire's remains and prepared to continue their journey. The horse seemed marginally better in the morning light, or perhaps Marcus just wanted to believe it was. The animal accepted the rope halter without resistance and followed when Marcus started the truck and began their slow procession down the road. The landscape around them looked different in daylight, less hostile somehow, though no less empty. Red rock formations glowed in the early sun, and the shadows they cast were sharp-edged and black. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that were already beginning to form as the temperature rose. They made steady, if painfully slow, progress through the morning hours. Marcus rationed the last of his food, sharing protein bars with the horse, breaking them into small pieces that the animal could manage with its swollen tongue. He found himself talking constantly now, his voice hoarse but unwavering, telling the horse about his life, about the war, about the things he had seen and done that haunted him. The horse listened, or seemed to. Its ear always turned toward Marcus's voice, and somehow the act of confession made the burden lighter. This animal didn't judge, didn't recoil from the darkness in Marcus's past. It simply accepted him, scars and all, just as he had accepted it. By noon, they reached a paved road, and Marcus felt a surge of hope so intense it made him dizzy. Pavement meant civilization was near, meant help was within reach. He turned the truck onto the smooth surface and increased their speed slightly, not much but enough that they covered the remaining distance faster. The horse sensed the change, too, its pace quickening despite its exhaustion, some instinct telling it that safety lay ahead. They passed the first building around 2 in the afternoon, an abandoned gas station with boarded windows and faded signs, but it meant they were close. So close. The town appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the heat, and Marcus had to blink several times to convince himself it was real. The town of Redstone was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. Marcus guided his truck and the exhausted white horse down Main Street, and within minutes, people began emerging from shops and houses, drawn by the unusual sight. An old pickup truck crawling along at walking speed, and beside it, a man who looked like he had been through hell, leading a white horse that looked even worse. The murmurs started immediately, spreading like wildfire through the small community, and Marcus felt dozens of eyes on him but couldn't bring himself to care about appearances or explanations. All that mattered was finding help. He spotted the veterinary clinic on the edge of town, a modest building with peeling paint and a hand-carved sign that read Rodriguez Veterinary Services. Marcus had never been so grateful to see a business sign in his life. He parked the truck in front of the clinic and tied the horse's rope to a post, then practically stumbled through the front door, his legs barely supporting him after walking for so many hours. The bell above the door chimed, incongruously cheerful, and a woman in her 30s looked up from behind the reception desk. Her expression shifted rapidly from professional greeting to shock as she took in Marcus's appearance. "I need help," Marcus managed to say, his voice coming out as barely more than a croak. "There's a horse outside. It's in bad shape. Real bad. Please." The receptionist was already moving, calling out for Dr. Rodriguez as she came around the desk. Through the door behind her emerged a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and competent-looking, with gray streaking his dark hair and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. He took one look at Marcus and immediately moved past him toward the door, the receptionist close behind. Marcus followed them outside on unsteady legs and watched as Dr. Rodriguez approached the white horse. The veterinarian's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, then something that looked like anger. "Who did this?" he asked quietly, his hands already moving over the horse's body with practiced efficiency, assessing the damage. His fingers found the wounds where the chains had cut deep, the dehydration evident in the horse's sunken flanks, the fever that Marcus could feel radiating from the animal's skin, even from several feet away. "I found it chained to a tree in the desert," Marcus said. "Been walking it back here since last night. Don't know who's responsible, but when I find out..." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The rage in his voice said everything. Dr. Rodriguez nodded grimly, understanding passing between them without further words. Some cruelties didn't require explanation, only action. The veterinarian turned to his receptionist and began rattling off instructions. Get the large animal stall ready. IV fluids, antibiotics, wound care supplies, everything we have. Call Maria and tell her we need her here now. This is going to be an all-hands situation." The receptionist hurried inside while Dr. Rodriguez continued his examination. Marcus stood nearby, swaying slightly, his vision starting to blur at the edges. The adrenaline that had kept him going for the past 24 hours was finally deserting him, leaving behind only exhaustion so profound it felt like gravity had tripled. He watched the veterinarian work, watched those skilled hands moving over the horse with confidence and care, and felt something inside him finally relax. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it to safety. "You did good getting this horse here," Dr. Rodriguez said without looking up from his examination. "Another day, maybe even hours, and we would have been having a very different conversation. As it is, I'm not going to lie to you. This animal is in critical condition. Multiple infected wounds, severe dehydration, possible internal injuries from struggling against those chains, and the psychological trauma on top of the physical. But it's alive, and as long as there's life, there's hope." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The veterinarian's words echoed something Marcus had told himself many times in the desert, and hearing them from someone else made them feel more real, more true. Dr. Rodriguez finally looked up at Marcus properly, and his expression shifted to concern. "Sir, you don't look so good yourself. When's the last time you ate? Drank anything? Those hands need medical attention too." Marcus glanced down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. They were swollen to nearly twice their normal size, the cuts angry and red, streaks of infection running up his forearms. "Oh," he said stupidly. "Yeah, I guess they do." The receptionist returned with another woman, presumably Maria, and together they began the careful process of moving the horse into the clinic's large animal stall. The white horse, sensing safety, or perhaps simply too exhausted to resist, allowed itself to be led inside. Marcus followed, unable to let the animal out of his sight, even though his body was screaming at him to sit down, to rest, to stop. In the stall, which was clean and spacious with fresh hay on the floor, the horse finally allowed its legs to fold, lowering itself to the ground with a groan that Marcus felt in his bones. Dr. Rodriguez worked quickly, establishing an IV line and starting fluids while Maria cleaned and dressed the wounds. Marcus watched from the stall door, leaning heavily against the frame, his eyes refusing to close despite his exhaustion. He saw the veterinarian's frown deepen as he examined the chain wounds on the horse's neck and legs, saw the gentle way he handled each injury, speaking softly to the animal the whole time. "This horse has a strong will to live," Dr. Rodriguez commented. "Most animals would have given up long before now." Marcus knew that was true, had seen that strength firsthand, and felt a fierce pride in this creature he barely knew. Time became fluid after that. Marcus was dimly aware of someone, the receptionist maybe, bringing him water and forcing him to drink. He remembered hands, not harsh but insistent, guiding him to a chair in the corner of the stall where he could watch the horse while sitting down. Someone cleaned his hands, the pain sharp enough to cut through his fog of exhaustion, and bandaged them properly. Voices spoke around him, discussing treatment plans and prognosis and care schedules, but the words blurred together into meaningless sound. All Marcus could focus on was the white horse, lying in the hay with tubes running into its veins, its sides rising and falling with each breath. Still alive, still fighting. At some point, Marcus must have fallen asleep because when he opened his eyes again, the light coming through the stall window had changed, grown softer and more golden. He jerked upright, panic flooding through him, his eyes immediately seeking the horse. The animal was still there, still breathing, though it hadn't moved from its position on the floor. Dr. Rodriguez sat on a stool nearby, making notes on a clipboard, and he looked up when Marcus stirred. "Welcome back," the veterinarian said with a tired smile. You were out for about 4 hours. Don't worry, your friend here is stable. Not out of danger yet, but stable. Marcus's throat was too tight to speak, so he just nodded. Dr. Rodriguez set down his clipboard and studied Marcus with the same assessing look he had given the horse. "You want to tell me the whole story?" he asked gently. "Not because I need to know for treatment, but because I think you might need to tell it." And Marcus found that he did need to tell it, needed to put into words the journey that had brought him to this moment. So he talked, his voice raw and halting, about finding the horse chained to the dead tree, about the desperate hours working to free it, about the long night walk back to civilization, with predators circling and death waiting at every step. Dr. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, his expression growing more somber as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished, the veterinarian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You saved this horse's life. You know that, right? Without you, it would have died alone and in agony in that desert." Marcus shook his head. "The horse saved itself," he replied. "I just gave it a chance." Dr. Rodriguez smiled slightly. "Maybe you saved each other," he suggested, and Marcus had no answer to that because he suspected it might be true. Over the next 3 days, Marcus barely left the clinic. Dr. Rodriguez had offered to let him stay in a small apartment above the veterinary office, a space usually reserved for students doing internships, but Marcus declined. He slept in the stall with the horse, wrapped in borrowed blankets, waking every few hours to check on the animal's condition. The staff tried to convince him to rest properly, to take care of himself, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. He had made a promise in that desert, an unspoken vow that he would see this through, and promises meant something to him, even when no one else knew they had been made. The horse's recovery was slow and precarious. The first 48 hours were critical, Dr. Rodriguez explained, as they fought off infection and tried to stabilize the animal's weakened system. Twice during those first 2 days, the horse's temperature spiked dangerously high, and Marcus watched helplessly as the veterinary team worked to bring it down, applying cold compresses and adjusting medications. During these crises, Marcus found himself praying, something he hadn't done since his combat days, bargaining with a God he wasn't sure he believed in. "Take me instead," he whispered in the darkness of the stall. "This creature doesn't deserve to suffer anymore. If someone has to pay, let it be me." But the horse held on. Its body fought the infections with a tenacity that amazed the medical staff, and slowly, incrementally, improvements began to show. The fever broke on the 3rd day, and the horse opened its eyes fully for the first time since arriving at the clinic. Those dark eyes found Marcus immediately, as if the animal had been searching for him, and Marcus felt his throat constrict with emotion. "Hey there," he said softly, moving to sit beside the horse's head. "Welcome back." The horse made a sound, not quite a whinny, but something gentler, and rested its muzzle against Marcus's leg. In that moment, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that they were bonded for life. Dr. Rodriguez came by during his morning rounds and found Marcus sitting in the hay, his hand resting on the horse's neck, both man and animal seemingly at peace. The veterinarian checked the IV lines and examined the wounds with satisfaction. "The infection is responding to treatment," he reported. "We're not out of the woods yet, but the prognosis is looking better. I'd say we're at maybe 60% chance of full recovery now, up from the 20% I gave when you first brought him in." Marcus nodded, absorbing this information. "Him?" he asked. "I've been calling it a horse, but I guess I never checked." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "Actually, it's a mare, female, probably around 7 or 8 years old based on her teeth. Purebred Arabian from the looks of her, or mostly Arabian anyway. These horses are known for their endurance and intelligence, which explains how she survived as long as she did in those conditions." Marcus looked at the white mare with new understanding. An Arabian. That made sense. He had seen similar horses during his deployments, elegant and tough in equal measure, bred for desert climates and capable of incredible feats of stamina. This mare had certainly proven that heritage. The question of ownership came up on the fourth day. A deputy from the county sheriff's office arrived at the clinic, a young man with a notebook and an apologetic expression. Dr. Rodriguez had filed a report about the mare's condition, and the law required an investigation into animal cruelty. The deputy asked Marcus to show him where he had found the horse, and reluctantly, Marcus agreed. He didn't want to leave the mare, but he understood the necessity. Justice needed to be served, and whoever had chained this beautiful creature to that tree needed to be held accountable. They drove out into the desert in the deputy's patrol car, Marcus giving directions from memory. The journey that had taken all night to walk seemed to pass in minutes by vehicle, and Marcus found himself almost disappointed by how quickly they arrived. When they reached the site, the dead tree still stood with the chains pooled at its base like metal snakes. The deputy took photographs and collected evidence while Marcus stood apart, his eyes on the horizon, remembering the moment he had first seen the white mare lying here in agony. The deputy tried to make conversation, asking Marcus about his military service and making small talk, but Marcus's responses were monosyllabic. He didn't want to be here. He wanted to be back at the clinic with the mare, wanted to see with his own eyes that she was still improving, still fighting. The desert that had seemed almost mystical during his rescue mission now felt empty and hostile, a place of suffering that he wanted to leave behind. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the deputy finished his work and they headed back to town. "You did a good thing, Mr. Webb," the deputy said as they drove. "Most people would have just called it in and driven on. You saved that horse's life." Marcus stared out the window at the passing landscape. "I did what anyone should have done," he replied flatly. "The fact that it seems exceptional says more about people than it does about me." The deputy fell silent after that, and they completed the journey without further conversation. Back at the clinic, Marcus found the mare standing for the first time since he had brought her in. She was shaky on her legs, Maria supporting her on one side while Dr. Rodriguez monitored from nearby, but she was upright. Marcus felt his heart leap at the sight. The mare's head turned at the sound of his footsteps, and her ears pricked forward in recognition. She took a tentative step toward him, and Marcus found himself moving to meet her, his hands reaching out to steady her. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "Don't push yourself too hard." But there was joy in his voice, unmistakable and pure, and the mare seemed to sense it. Dr. Rodriguez was grinning. "She's been waiting for you," he said. "Wouldn't settle down until you got back. I think she's imprinted on you, which isn't surprising given the circumstances. You're her herd now, her safety. Where you go, she'll want to follow." Marcus stroked the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steady beat of her pulse beneath his fingers. The thought of being responsible for another life should have terrified him. He had spent years convinced that he was toxic, that everyone he cared about ended up hurt or dead. But looking at this mare, seeing the trust in her eyes, he felt something different. Purpose, connection, a reason to keep going that existed outside his own survival. That night, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't leave the mare, couldn't return to his aimless wandering and expect her to be okay without him. But more than that, he didn't want to leave. For the first time since returning from overseas, Marcus felt like he had found something worth staying for. The next morning, he approached Dr. Rodriguez with a question that had been forming in his mind. "What happens to her now?" he asked. "When she's recovered enough to leave the clinic, where does she go?" Dr. Rodriguez leaned against the stall door, considering his answer carefully. "Legally, she's considered abandoned property. After the investigation concludes, If no owner comes forward to claim her, she'll likely end up at an animal rescue or sanctuary. There are a few good ones in the region that specialize in horses. She'll be well cared for." Marcus nodded slowly, but his chest felt tight. The thought of the mare being sent away, of never seeing her again after everything they had been through together, was unbearable. "What if someone wanted to adopt her?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Would that be possible?" Dr. Rodriguez's face broke into a knowing smile. "I was hoping you'd ask that," he said. "Yes, once she's medically cleared and the legal issues are resolved, adoption would absolutely be possible. There would be paperwork, costs for her care, and you'd need somewhere to keep her. But if you're serious about this, I can help make it happen." Marcus was serious. More serious than he had been about anything in years. The thought crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. He would keep the mare. He would build a life that included her, would create stability where there had been only drift. The decision felt monumental and simple at the same time, as if everything in his life had been leading to this moment in a dusty veterinary clinic in a small desert town. Dr. Rodriguez must have seen the determination in Marcus's face because his smile widened. "Let me make some calls," the veterinarian said. "I know a man who owns property just outside town. He's been looking for a caretaker, someone to manage the land and keep an eye on things. It's not much, but there's a small house and a barn with a few stalls. Might be perfect for you and your girl here." Within 2 days, Dr. Rodriguez had arranged everything. The property owner, a retired rancher named Tom Hendricks, came to the clinic to meet Marcus. Tom was in his 70s, weathered by decades of desert sun, with hands that shook slightly from arthritis, but eyes that remained sharp and assessing. He looked Marcus up and down, noted the military bearing that Marcus couldn't fully hide even in his exhausted state, and seemed to come to some private conclusion. "Doc Rodriguez tells me you saved a horse from dying in the desert," Tom said without preamble. "That true?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir, it is." Tom grunted. "Also tells me you're a veteran." "Iraq? Afghanistan?" "Both," Marcus replied quietly. Tom was silent for a long moment, studying Marcus with an intensity that made him want to shift uncomfortably. Then the old rancher nodded as if confirming something to himself. "My son served in Vietnam," he said. "Came back different. Couldn't settle, couldn't find his place. Ended up taking his own life when he was 40. Marcus felt his chest tighten but said nothing. Tom continued, his voice rough with old grief. "I've spent 30 years wondering if there was something I could have done, some way I could have helped him find a reason to keep going. Can't change the past, but maybe I can do something for someone else's son. The job is yours if you want it. Housing, utilities, and a small salary. In return, you maintain the property and keep it secure. Deal?" Marcus found his voice with difficulty. "Deal," he managed. "Thank you, sir." Tom waved off the gratitude. "Thank me by taking care of that horse and yourself. In that order. Now let's go see this property before you commit to something you haven't even looked at." The ranch was 15 minutes outside Redstone, accessed by a dirt road that wound through red rock canyons. The house was small, 2 bedrooms with a kitchen and living area, but it was clean and solid. The barn was better than Marcus had dared hope, with 4 stalls, a tack room, and a small corral. There was even a pasture, maybe 3 acres, with decent fencing and a stock tank fed by a well. "This is more than I expected," Marcus said, looking around the property with something approaching wonder. "It's been sitting empty for 2 years, Tom replied. "My wife passed, and I moved into town to be closer to doctors and such. Been meaning to hire a caretaker, but couldn't find anyone I trusted. You come recommended by Doc Rodriguez, and that's good enough for me. There's one condition, though." Marcus turned to face him. "What's that?" Tom's expression was serious. "You promise me you'll reach out if you need help. I see the signs, son. I saw them in my boy, too. Being alone out here can be good for healing, but it can also be dangerous if you're carrying too much weight. You've got my number. You use it if things get dark." Marcus swallowed hard, moved by the old man's perceptiveness and concern. "I promise," he said, and meant it. Tom seemed satisfied with that answer and spent the next hour showing Marcus around the property, explaining the well system and the generator, pointing out where supplies were stored and how to handle the basics. By the time they returned to town, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that might include more than just surviving from one day to the next. The mare continued to improve steadily over the following week. Her wounds began to heal, the angry red inflammation fading to pink scar tissue. Her appetite returned with a vengeance, and she put on weight visibly, her ribs becoming less prominent with each passing day. The psychological recovery took longer. Loud noises still made her panic, and she showed signs of deep trauma whenever someone approached with rope or chains. But with Marcus, she was different. With Marcus, she was calm. She would rest her head on his shoulder, follow him around the stall, and whinny softly whenever he left the clinic, as if asking him not to go. Dr. Rodriguez worked with Marcus on basic horse care, teaching him everything he would need to know. How to clean hooves, how to check for signs of illness, proper feeding schedules, and exercise routines. Marcus absorbed the information with the same focused intensity he had once applied to military training. This was his new mission, his new purpose, and he would be good at it. He owed the mare nothing less than his complete commitment. Maria, the veterinary assistant, showed him how to properly groom a horse, and Marcus spent hours each day brushing the mare's white coat, removing tangles from her mane and tail, talking to her constantly in that low, steady voice that seemed to soothe them both. The legal situation resolved itself faster than expected. The deputy's investigation found no registered owner for the mare, no brand or microchip that might identify where she came from. The chains were a dead end, sold at dozens of hardware stores across 3 states with no way to trace the buyer. Whoever had abandoned the mare had covered their tracks well, or perhaps had simply been a random act of cruelty from someone passing through. The district attorney declared the mare abandoned property, and after the required waiting period, Marcus was able to formally begin adoption proceedings. The paperwork was tedious, but Marcus filled out every form with meticulous care, his hands steady despite the healing wounds that still ached. On the day the mare was cleared to leave the clinic, Marcus borrowed Tom's horse trailer and brought it around to the loading area behind the building. Dr. Rodriguez and Maria came out to see them off, along with several other staff members who had grown attached to the white mare during her recovery. "She's come so far," Maria said, her eyes misty. "I honestly didn't think she would make it those first few days." "You worked a miracle, Mr. Webb." Marcus shook his head. "She did the work. I just gave her the chance." "Doctor." Rodriguez handed Marcus a folder thick with medical records, care instructions, and follow-up appointment schedules. "You call me if anything concerns you," he said firmly. "Day or night, doesn't matter. This horse means something to you, which means she means something to me, too." Loading the mare into the trailer was a tense moment. She balked at the ramp, her eyes wide with remembered fear, and for a moment Marcus thought they might have a serious problem. But he walked up the ramp first, turned, and called to her softly. "Trust me, girl. I've never let you down yet." The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, and after a long, considering moment, she took a tentative step forward. Then another. Then she was beside him in the trailer, pressing against his side, trembling but trusting. Marcus felt his throat close with emotion at this display of faith. The drive to the ranch was slow and careful, Marcus hyper-aware of his precious cargo. When they arrived, he unloaded the mare and led her into the barn, into a stall he had spent the previous day preparing with fresh hay and clean water, and everything he could think of that might make her comfortable. The mare explored her new home cautiously, sniffing at corners and pawing at the ground. Then she turned to look at Marcus, and he could have sworn he saw something like contentment in her expression. "This is home now," he told her. "For both of us. We're going to be okay here." That night, Marcus slept in the barn, unable to quite leave the mare alone yet. He lay in the hay beside her stall, wrapped in blankets, listening to the sounds of her breathing and the occasional shuffle of hooves. The desert night pressed in around the barn, vast and dark and full of stars, but Marcus didn't feel alone. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he had a place in the world that made sense. The mare dozed standing up, one hip cocked, her head lowered in relaxation, and Marcus watched her with a sense of profound gratitude. She had saved him as surely as he had saved her, though in ways he was only beginning to understand. The first weeks at the ranch established a rhythm that Marcus hadn't known he needed. He woke before dawn, his internal clock still set to military time, and would immediately check on the mare. She was always awake when he arrived at the barn, as if she too had been waiting for this moment, this confirmation that he hadn't left her during the night. Marcus would run his hands over her body, checking for any signs of injury or illness, a morning ritual that calmed them both. Then came feeding, grooming, and the slow walks around the property that gradually lengthened as the mare's strength returned. Marcus named her Ghost, a name that felt appropriate for a white mare who had come so close to death and somehow remained. The name also felt personal in ways he didn't examine too closely, a reflection of how he had felt for years, present but not fully alive, visible but not truly seen. Ghost seemed to understand her name from the first time Marcus spoke it, her ears pricking forward in recognition. It became a sound that meant safety, that meant home, that meant the one person in the world who would never abandon her. The work of maintaining Tom's property gave Marcus's days structure and purpose. He repaired fencing, cleared brush, maintained the well system, and kept detailed records of everything he did. Tom visited weekly, ostensibly to check on the property, but really, Marcus suspected, to check on him. The old rancher would sit on the porch with coffee, watching Marcus work with Ghost, and sometimes he would share stories about his own life, about his son, about the weight of grief and the possibility of healing. These conversations were never forced, never felt like therapy, but Marcus found himself opening up in ways he hadn't with the VA counselors or the well-meaning people who had tried to help him before. Ghost's physical recovery progressed steadily, but her psychological scars required more patience. Sudden movement still frightened her, and the sight of chains or heavy rope could send her into a panic. Marcus learned to move slowly around her, to announce his presence, to give her space to process and choose to approach him rather than forcing interaction. He read books about horse behavior and trauma, consulted with Dr. Rodriguez regularly, and applied the same methodical approach he had once used for mission planning to understanding Ghost's needs. There were setbacks. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the desert with dramatic suddenness. The crack of thunder and flash of lightning sent Ghost into a frenzy of fear. She reared in her stall, eyes rolling white, calling out in distress. Marcus rushed to the barn and found her trembling violently, sweat darkening her white coat. He didn't try to calm her with words or touch. Instead, he simply sat down in the corner of her stall and began talking about his own fear, about the nightmares that woke him at 3 a.m, about the sound of mortars that he still heard in thunderstorms. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm scared too. Been scared for years. But we're safe here, Ghost. Nobody's gonna hurt us here." The mare's wild circling gradually slowed. She stopped at the far corner of the stall, sides heaving, watching Marcus with those dark, frightened eyes. Then slowly, she took a step toward him, then another. By the time the storm passed, Ghost was standing beside Marcus, her head lowered so that her muzzle rested on his shoulder, both of them breathing in sync. It was a breakthrough moment, a recognition that fear shared was somehow less overwhelming than fear faced alone. Marcus began taking Ghost on longer excursions around the property, leading her through the desert landscape at a pace she could manage. These walks became the highlight of both their days. Ghost would move close beside him, sometimes pushing her nose into his hand as if seeking reassurance, other times ranging ahead with growing confidence. Marcus found himself talking to her constantly, narrating their surroundings, sharing thoughts he had never spoken aloud to another human. The mare was a perfect listener, non-judgmental and present, her attention a gift Marcus had forgotten he could receive. During one of these walks, they discovered a small spring-fed pool hidden in a rocky canyon. The water was clear and cool, surrounded by cottonwood trees that provided rare shade in the desert heat. Ghost approached the water cautiously, then plunged her muzzle in and drank deeply. Marcus sat on a rock nearby, watching her, and felt something close to contentment settle over him. This moment, this simple scene of a horse drinking from a spring, felt more significant than medals or commendations ever had. This was real. This was what living felt like. Tom noticed the change in Marcus during one of his visits. "You look different," the old rancher observed, studying Marcus with those sharp eyes. "Sleep better?" Marcus considered the question. "Yeah," he admitted. "The nightmares are still there, but they're less frequent." Tom nodded slowly. "That horse is good for you. My wife used to say that animals have a way of pulling us out of ourselves, making us focus on something beyond our own pain." Think she was right. Marcus looked toward the barn where Ghost dozed in her stall. "She saved my life," he said simply. Tom smiled. "And you saved hers. Seems like a fair trade to me." As the weeks turned into months, Ghost transformed before Marcus's eyes. The thin, traumatized creature he had found in the desert became a robust, healthy mare with a gleaming coat and bright eyes. Her wounds healed into white scars that would always mark her body, but no longer limited her movement. She gained weight, muscle filling out her frame until she looked like the Arabian beauty she was meant to be. But more than her physical transformation, Ghost's spirit emerged. She began to play, bucking and running in the pasture for the sheer joy of movement. She showed curiosity about her environment, investigating every corner of her new home with eager interest. Marcus found himself transforming too, though the changes in him were more subtle. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for years began to ease. The hypervigilance that had exhausted him started to fade. He still had bad days, moments when the past crashed over him like a wave, but now he had something to anchor him. He had Ghost who depended on him, who needed him, who gave him a reason to get up every morning and face the day. It wasn't a cure, Marcus understood. Trauma didn't work that way, but it was a path forward, a way of living with the weight he carried rather than being crushed by it. Dr. Rodriguez came out to the ranch for a follow-up visit and pronounced Ghost fully recovered. "This mare is a testament to resilience," he said, running his hands over her legs and checking her movement as Marcus led her around the corral. "Both of you are, actually." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the praise but recognized the truth in it. They had both survived what should have killed them. They had both found reasons to keep fighting when giving up would have been easier. The veterinarian pulled Marcus aside before leaving. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through photos. This is what she looked like that first day. Marcus looked at the image and felt his breath catch. The skeletal creature in the photo barely resembled the healthy mare, now grazing peacefully in the pasture. The contrast was stark and almost unbelievable. "That's what hope looks like," Dr. Rodriguez said quietly. That's what refusing to give up creates. You both did that together. Marcus couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded. The veterinarian clapped him on the shoulder and headed for his truck, leaving Marcus standing in the desert sun, staring at a photo that captured both the worst moment of Ghost's life and the beginning of her salvation. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red across the desert sky, Marcus sat on the porch with Ghost standing nearby, her head hanging over the fence rail. He reached out and stroked her soft muzzle, and she leaned into the touch with trust that still amazed him. "We made it," he told her. "Against all odds, we made it." Ghost's ears flicked toward his voice, and her eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes, held his gaze with something that looked remarkably like understanding. In the gathering darkness, with the desert spreading vast and beautiful around them, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt grateful to be alive. 6 months after finding Ghost in the desert, Marcus received a phone call that would change everything. The deputy who had investigated the case called on a Tuesday morning, his voice careful and measured. "Mr. Webb, we've had a development in your horse's case. Someone came forward claiming ownership." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The coffee cup in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt sideways. "What do you mean someone came forward?" "Ghost is mine. I went through all the legal procedures." The deputy sighed, a sound heavy with understanding. "I know, and you did everything right. But this man, his name is Richard Caldwell, he filed a police report about a stolen horse 6 months ago. White Arabian mare, matches the description of your horse exactly. He has papers, registration documents, the whole thing. Says she was taken from his property during a break-in." Marcus's mind raced, trying to process this information. If that was true, why was she chained to a tree in the middle of nowhere? The deputy's voice grew darker. "That's what we're trying to figure out. His story doesn't quite add up, but legally, if he can prove ownership, we have to investigate." Marcus hung up the phone and walked to the barn on numb legs. Ghost was in her stall, contentedly munching hay, completely unaware that her world might be about to collapse again. Marcus stood watching her, his hands gripping the stall door so hard his knuckles went white. Over his dead body, would anyone take this mare from him? They had saved each other, had built something real and meaningful together. Ghost was no longer just a horse to him. She was family, the only family that mattered, and he would fight with everything he had to keep her. Tom arrived within an hour of Marcus calling him, bringing with him a woman Marcus hadn't met before. "This is Sarah Chen," Tom explained. "She's a lawyer, specializes in animal law. I called her as soon as you told me what was happening." Sarah was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient, with a briefcase full of documents and a no-nonsense attitude that Marcus found immediately reassuring. "Tell me everything," she said, sitting at Marcus's kitchen table and pulling out a legal pad. "Start from the moment you found her." Marcus talked for over an hour, laying out every detail of Ghost's rescue, her condition, the investigation, the legal process he had followed to adopt her. Sarah took notes, asked pointed questions, and occasionally exchanged glances with Tom that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. When he finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her pad thoughtfully. "Here's the situation," she said. "If this Caldwell person can prove prior ownership, it complicates things. However, the fact that the horse was found in the condition you described, clearly abandoned and suffering, gives us legal grounds to argue abandonment and forfeiture of ownership rights." Over the next week, Sarah worked tirelessly on Marcus's behalf, filing motions and gathering evidence. Dr. Rodriguez provided detailed medical records documenting Ghost's condition when Marcus brought her in, complete with photographs that made even Sarah wince. The deputy shared his investigation files, including photos of the chains and the dead tree where Ghost had been found. Tom provided character references for Marcus, and several townspeople who had watched Ghost's recovery offered to testify if needed. But Richard Caldwell had resources too, and he hired expensive lawyers who filed counter-motions and demanded immediate return of the horse. The hearing was set for a Friday morning at the county courthouse. Marcus barely slept the night before, lying awake and staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every possible outcome. He got up before dawn and went to the barn, needing to see Ghost, to touch her, and reassure himself that she was still there. The mare sensed his distress immediately, moving close and pressing her warm body against him. Marcus wrapped his arms around her neck and allowed himself a moment of weakness, his face buried in her mane, his breathing ragged with suppressed emotion. "I won't let them take you," he promised her. "I don't care what I have to do." The courthouse was a squat building of red brick and white columns, imposing in its small-town way. Marcus arrived with Sarah and Tom dressed in the only dress clothes he owned, feeling like he was heading into combat. In the hallway outside the courtroom, he got his first look at Richard Caldwell. The man was in his 50s, expensively dressed with styled hair and manicured hands that had clearly never done hard labor. He stood with his lawyers, 3 of them in sharp suits, and when his eyes met Marcus's, there was something cold and calculating in his gaze. The hearing began, and Caldwell's lawyers presented their case first. They produced registration papers showing that Caldwell had purchased an Arabian mare, matching Ghost's description 2 years prior. They showed the police report he had filed claiming the horse was stolen, though Marcus noted the report was dated 3 weeks after he had found Ghost, not before. They painted Caldwell as a victim of theft, an innocent owner whose property had been wrongly taken. Through it all, Caldwell sat looking aggrieved and concerned, the picture of a man who simply wanted his horse returned. Then it was Sarah's turn. She started with the photographs, projecting them on a screen for the judge to see. Images of Ghost chained to the tree, skeletal and dying, covered in wounds. The courtroom went silent as the photos cycled through, each one more damning than the last. "This is the condition Mr. Webb found this mare in, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet room. "Does this look like a horse that was stolen, or does this look like a horse that was deliberately abandoned to die?" She called Dr. Rodriguez to testify, and the veterinarian described Ghost's injuries in clinical detail. The chains had been on for days, possibly over a week, he stated. The dehydration was life-threatening. Without Mr. Webb's intervention, this animal would have been dead within 24 hours. Sarah asked pointed questions about how a stolen horse might end up in such a condition, and Dr. Rodriguez's answers made it clear that the timeline didn't match Caldwell's story. Marcus testified last, describing the moment he found Ghost and the decision to save her. He spoke about the journey back to town, the long nights watching over her recovery, the bond they had formed. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he explained what Ghost had come to mean to him. "She's not just a horse to me," he said, looking directly at the judge. "She's the reason I'm still here. The reason I found a way forward when I thought there wasn't one. Taking her from me now, after everything we've been through, it would destroy us both." During cross-examination, Caldwell's lawyers tried to paint Marcus as an opportunist who had taken advantage of finding a valuable horse. But their questions backfired when Marcus calmly detailed the thousands of dollars he had spent on Ghost's medical care, the months of work rehabilitating her, the life he had built around ensuring her well-being. This wasn't about money or property for him. This was about love and commitment and the promise he had made to a dying animal in the desert. The judge called a brief recess, and Marcus stepped outside, his heart pounding. Sarah joined him, her expression cautiously optimistic. "You did well in there," she said. "The judge is clearly moved by your testimony. But Caldwell's lawyers are good, and the ownership papers are legitimate. This could go either way." Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the fear constricting his throat. Tom appeared with coffee, and they stood in tense silence, waiting. When the judge called them back, the courtroom felt smaller, the air heavier. Everyone rose as the judge entered, then sat in collective anticipation. The judge shuffled papers, adjusted his glasses, and finally looked up. His expression was difficult to read, but his voice was firm and clear. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony carefully," he began. "This case presents some complex legal questions about ownership rights versus animal welfare. Mr. Caldwell, your registration papers establish prior ownership. However, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that this mare was not stolen, but deliberately abandoned in conditions that constituted severe animal cruelty." The judge paused, and Marcus felt time suspend. Under state law, an owner who abandons an animal and allows it to suffer extreme neglect and abuse forfeits their ownership rights. The condition this mare was found in, the length of time she was left to suffer, and the timing discrepancies in your theft report all point to abandonment, not theft. Furthermore, Mr. Webb has demonstrated extraordinary care and commitment to this animal's recovery and well-being. The judge looked directly at Marcus. "It is the judgment of this court that ownership rights are awarded to Marcus Webb. Mr. Caldwell, you are barred from any contact with the animal, and I'm referring this case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges of animal cruelty." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like liberation. Marcus felt his legs go weak, and Tom's steadying hand on his shoulder was the only thing that kept him upright. Sarah was smiling, a fierce, triumphant expression that matched the surge of relief and joy flooding through Marcus's body. Across the aisle, Caldwell's face had gone purple with rage, and his lawyers were already gathering papers, preparing appeals that Sarah quietly assured Marcus would go nowhere. The evidence was too damning, the judge's ruling too clear. Ghost was his, truly, legally, permanently his. Marcus drove back to the ranch in a daze, Tom following behind in his own truck. The desert landscape that had seemed threatening and hostile when he first arrived now looked like home, every red rock and twisted juniper tree familiar and beloved. When they pulled up to the house, Marcus got out and walked straight to the barn. Ghost was waiting, her white head over the stall door, ears pricked forward at the sound of his approach. She whinnied softly, that particular sound she made only for him, and Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as he reached her. "She's ours," he said, his voice breaking. "Nobody can take you away. We're safe." Ghost pushed her nose into his chest, and Marcus wrapped his arms around her neck, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. Tom watched from the barn entrance, and when Marcus finally pulled back and wiped his eyes, the old rancher was smiling. "My wife would have loved this," Tom said quietly. "She always believed that the right souls find each other when they need to most. You two proved her right, too." The story of the court case spread through Redstone faster than Marcus expected. Within days, people he barely knew were stopping him in town to congratulate him, to tell him how moved they were by his testimony, to share their own stories of animals who had changed their lives. The local newspaper ran a feature article with a photo of Marcus and Ghost, and suddenly the quiet life he had been building became something more public. Marcus found this attention uncomfortable at first, but Sarah helped him see an opportunity in it. "There are others like you," she told him over coffee at the town's only diner. "Veterans struggling to find their footing, animals in need of rescue. You and Ghost could help them find each other." The idea took root in Marcus's mind slowly, germinating over weeks of consideration. He talked to Dr. Rodriguez about it, to Tom, to other veterans he had begun tentatively connecting with at the VA center in the nearby city. The consensus was clear. There was a need, and Marcus had the experience and the space to meet it. 6 months after the court victory, Marcus opened what he called the Desert Hope Ranch. It started small, just one other rescue horse and one veteran looking for a fresh start. The veteran was a young woman named Jessica, recently returned from deployment, whose nightmares and anxiety had made civilian life feel impossible. Marcus showed her how to care for the rescue horse, a bay gelding who had been seized from a neglect situation. He taught her the routines he had learned with Ghost, the patience required, the way working with traumatized animals somehow helped work through your own trauma. Jessica thrived under the structure and purpose, and watching her transformation reminded Marcus of his own journey. The ranch expanded gradually, carefully, never taking on more than they could properly care for. Tom donated additional acreage, and local fundraising helped build more stalls and a proper indoor arena. Dr. Rodriguez became the ranch's primary veterinarian, donating much of his time and expertise. The community that had watched Marcus save Ghost now rallied to help him save others. Ghost herself seemed to understand her new role as the ranch's matriarch. She was gentle with the other horses, often standing near the newcomers as they adjusted to their new home, offering the same quiet companionship she had received from Marcus. With the visiting veterans, she showed remarkable intuition, allowing those who needed her calm presence to simply stand beside her, making no demands, offering no judgment. More than one person who came to the ranch broke and left with hope, and many credited Ghost as the turning point in their healing. Marcus found that helping others gave his life a meaning he had never imagined possible. Each rescue, whether animal or human, felt like paying forward the grace he had received in that desert 6 months ago. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were less frequent now. And when they did wake him in the dark hours, he would walk to the barn and sit with Ghost, and her presence would anchor him back to reality, back to peace. On the anniversary of finding Ghost, Marcus woke before dawn and walked to their special place, the spring-fed pool in the canyon. Ghost followed without needing to be led, her white coat luminous in the pre-dawn light. They stood together by the water, watching the sky lighten from black to purple to pink to gold. Marcus thought about the man he had been a year ago, lost and purposeless, driving aimlessly through the desert looking for something he couldn't name. He thought about the dying horse chained to a tree, suffering alone in the wasteland. Neither of them were those broken creatures anymore. They had saved each other, healed each other, and in doing so had created something beautiful from pain. The ranch was more than just a place now. It was proof that redemption was possible, that second chances were real, that love could grow even in the harshest conditions. Marcus ran his hand along Ghost's neck, feeling the steady beat of her pulse beneath his palm, and marveled at how much life could change in a single year. Ghost lowered her head to drink from the pool, and her reflection shimmered on the water's surface, a white ghost indeed, but one made of light and life rather than death and memory. Marcus saw his own reflection beside hers, and for the first time in years, he didn't flinch away from what he saw there. The scars were still visible, both the physical ones on his hands and the invisible ones in his eyes, but they were no longer the only thing he could see. There was strength there too, and purpose, and something that might even be called peace. They stayed at the spring until the sun was fully risen, man and horse together in the desert morning, two survivors who had found their way home. When they finally turned back toward the ranch, Marcus noticed fresh hoof prints in the soft earth beside the spring. He and Ghost weren't the only ones who came here seeking solace. The desert was full of creatures trying to survive, trying to find water and shelter and a place to rest. Maybe that's all any of them were doing, Marcus thought, just trying to survive until they found someone who saw them, who chose to help, who refused to look away from suffering. Back at the ranch, the day's work awaited. There were horses to feed, stalls to clean, fences to mend. There was a new veteran arriving that afternoon, a man Tom had connected with through the VA, someone who needed what Desert Hope Ranch offered. Marcus would meet him, show him around, introduce him to the horses, and maybe tell him the story of how this all began. How a broken veteran and a dying horse had found each other in the wasteland and decided to live. Ghost walked beside Marcus toward the barn, her shoulder brushing his, her breath warm in the cool morning air. The desert stretched vast around them, no longer empty but full of possibility, no longer hostile but home. Above them, a hawk called out, riding thermals toward the sun, and Marcus watched it soar with something approaching joy. He had learned to fly again too, in his own way. They both had, and together they would help others remember that they had wings. The white mare of the desert had become a symbol of hope for everyone who encountered her, but for Marcus, she would always be something more personal and profound. She was the reason he got up each morning. She was the proof that love could heal even the deepest wounds. She was his ghost, his companion, his salvation. And as they walked together into the growing light of a new day, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that finding her chained to that tree had been the moment his real life began. Everything before was just surviving. This finally was living.